Sometimes the road is not empty at all. Sometimes it is simply waiting for the right pair of eyes to notice who is coming. The old county road stretched through the northern hills like a faded ribbon forgotten by time. Years ago, trucks and campers had traveled it every summer, but now most people took the newer highway 20 miles east. The pavement was cracked, weeds pushed through the edges, and weathered utility poles leaned slightly toward the forest as if they were growing tired of standing. Ethan Walker drove slowly along the abandoned route, his old silver pickup humming softly beneath the pale afternoon sky. The truck had seen better years, much like the man behind the wheel. At 40 years old, Ethan carried himself with the quiet strength of someone who had spent much of his life helping others while rarely asking for help himself. His dark brown hair showed the first traces of silver near his temples, and the lines around his gray eyes had been carved not by age, but by long winters, hard lessons, and memories he rarely spoke about. Beside him sat Ranger, a 6-year-old German shepherd whose broad chest and alert posture made him look less like a pet and more like a trusted partner. The dog's silver and cream coat glowed softly whenever sunlight slipped through the clouds. His amber eyes constantly scanned the world beyond the windshield, noticing details most people would miss. For miles they traveled in silence. The forest rolled past in shades of pine green and autumn gold. Wind brushed through the treetops, creating a whispering sound that seemed almost like distant voices drifting across the hills. Ethan rested one hand on the steering wheel while the other tapped lightly against the door. There was nowhere urgent to be. No schedule waiting for him. No place calling him home. Then Ranger suddenly sat upright. His ears locked forward. Every muscle in his body became still. Ethan noticed immediately. Ranger was not a dog who reacted without reason. "What is it, boy?" he asked quietly. The German shepherd did not bark. He did not growl. He simply stared through the windshield. Ethan followed his gaze. Ahead stretched another quarter-mile of empty road. No vehicles. No cyclists. No hikers. Nothing but fading sunlight spilling across cracked asphalt. Yet Ranger refused to look away. The dog remained frozen, eyes fixed on a single point far ahead. Seconds passed, then a full minute. Ethan eased off the accelerator. The truck slowed to a crawl. Ranger's breathing had changed. Not frightened. Not aggressive. Focused. Listening. Waiting. The same way he used to wait before finding someone lost during search and rescue training years ago. A cold breeze swept across the road. Dry leaves danced along the shoulder. Somewhere in the woods, a wind chime rang faintly despite there being no house nearby. Ethan felt a strange sensation he could not explain, as though the quiet landscape itself had paused to hold its breath. Ranger shifted forward and placed one paw against the dashboard. His eyes never blinked, never moved. Then, far ahead where the road disappeared into a curtain of silver mist, a shape emerged. At first Ethan thought it was a trick of the light. A shadow. A reflection. But slowly the figure became clearer. A man. Walking alone. No vehicle nearby. No backpack. No bicycle. No sign of where he had come from. Just a solitary stranger stepping out of the fog, as if he had been hidden there all along. Ranger's ears twitched once. The dog let out a soft breath and continued watching. And for reasons Ethan could not explain, he suddenly felt certain of one thing. Ranger had known the man was coming long before the road revealed him. The stranger continued walking at an unhurried pace, his boots making soft contact with the cracked pavement as the afternoon light settled across the hills. Ethan pulled the truck onto the gravel shoulder and shifted into park. The engine fell silent. For a moment, the only sounds were the wind moving through the pines and the distant rustle of dry leaves rolling across the road. Ranger remained perfectly still, watching. The man appeared to be somewhere in his early 70s. He was tall but lean, wearing a weathered brown jacket that looked older than some of the buildings in the nearest town. Silver hair peeked from beneath a faded canvas cap, and his face carried the kind of lines that came from decades spent outdoors rather than from age alone. There was nothing threatening about him. In fact, there was something strangely familiar in the way he moved, as though he belonged to the landscape itself. The stranger stopped a few feet from the truck and studied Ranger before he looked at Ethan. His blue eyes were calm and thoughtful. For several seconds he said nothing at all. Then a faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I knew a dog exactly like him once," he said quietly. Ethan glanced at Ranger. The German shepherd had not relaxed. His ears remained forward, his amber eyes fixed on the man. Yet there was no sign of alarm. If anything, Ranger seemed deeply curious. "Did you?" Ethan asked. The old man nodded. "Long time ago." His gaze drifted briefly toward the forest beyond the road. "Smartest dog I ever met. Always knew things before the rest of us." A breeze swept through the valley. The scent of pine needles and distant rain filled the air. Ethan stepped out of the truck and closed the door behind him. Up close, he noticed the man's hands. They were rough and weathered, marked by years of work. "You live around here?" Ethan asked. The stranger chuckled softly. "Not exactly." His answer sounded honest, yet somehow incomplete. Ranger suddenly jumped down from the passenger seat and approached him. Ethan watched carefully. The German Shepherd circled once, then stopped directly in front of the man. For a long moment, they simply looked at one another. The old man lowered a hand. Ranger sniffed it, then sat down. That surprised Ethan more than anything. Ranger trusted very few people that quickly. "Looks like he remembers something," the stranger said. Ethan frowned. "They have never met." "Maybe not." The man glanced toward the distant mountains. "But sometimes animals recognize things we do not." The words lingered in the quiet air. Clouds drifted slowly across the pale sky. Somewhere far off, a raven called from the treetops. The stranger reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small brass compass. Its metal surface had grown dull with age. He turned it thoughtfully in his hand before slipping it back into his pocket. "My name is Samuel Reed," he finally said, "and I have been hoping to find this road again for more than 50 years. Ethan studied him carefully. There was no sign of deception in his expression, only a sadness that seemed very old. Samuel looked toward Ranger once more. "The truth is," he said softly, "I did not expect anyone to be here today." His eyes drifted toward the distant ridge rising beyond the forest. "But there is something waiting up there." He pointed toward the mountain hidden beneath layers of fading autumn mist. "And I think your dog already knows where it is." For several moments, none of them spoke. The wind moved gently through the pines that covered the lower slopes of the mountain, carrying the scent of cedar, damp earth, and the faint promise of approaching rain. Ethan followed Samuel's gaze toward the distant ridge. From where they stood, the mountain appeared ordinary enough, just another rise among hundreds scattered across the northern wilderness. Yet something about the way Samuel looked at it made the place feel different, as though it carried a memory too large to fit inside a single lifetime. Ranger stood and turned toward the mountain as well. His ears remained alert. His tail hung still behind him. The German Shepherd seemed less interested in the stranger now and more focused on whatever waited beyond the trees. Samuel noticed. "He feels it," he said quietly. Ethan crossed his arms. "Feels what?" Samuel smiled faintly, though sadness lingered behind the expression. "The same thing that brought me back." A cloud drifted across the sun, softening the afternoon light. Shadows stretched longer across the empty road. Samuel walked to the edge of the shoulder and looked toward the forest below the ridge. "There used to be a house up there," he said. "A long time ago, before the road was abandoned. Before most people forgot this place existed." Ethan listened without interrupting. Years had taught him that people often revealed more when silence was allowed to do some of the work. Samuel continued. "I lived there when I was young, back when these hills still had families, farms, and children running through the fields. It was not a grand house, just wood, stone, and hard work. But it meant everything to me." Ranger suddenly began walking several feet toward the mountain. He stopped, looked back at Ethan, then looked uphill again. Ethan noticed the behavior immediately. Ranger rarely acted without purpose. "You said there used to be a house," Ethan said. "What happened to it?" Samuel lowered his eyes. "Life happened." The answer came softly. "One mistake became another, then another. Eventually I left." He paused. "I kept telling myself I would come back one day. Weeks became months. Months became years. Before I realized it, half a century had passed." The old man's voice carried no bitterness, only regret, the kind that settles into a person after decades of unfinished promises. A gust of wind moved through the valley. Dry leaves spiraled across the road before disappearing into the trees. Somewhere high above, a hawk circled silently against the pale sky. Samuel reached into his jacket and removed an old photograph. The edges had yellowed with age. He handed it to Ethan. The image showed a small mountain house surrounded by tall pines. A young man stood on the porch beside an older woman whose smile seemed bright enough to illuminate the entire picture. Ethan looked up. "Your family?" Samuel nodded slowly. "The woman was my mother." His eyes lingered on the photograph. She believed every place carried a soul. She used to say that if a home was built with kindness, it would wait patiently for the people meant to return. Ranger approached and sniffed the photograph briefly before looking toward the mountain once more. Samuel watched the dog carefully. "I do not have much time left," he said. The words were simple, spoken without fear. "That is why I came back." Ethan studied him. Samuel's face remained calm, but there was a weariness beneath it now, something deeper than age. "What are you hoping to find up there?" Ethan asked. The old man looked toward the distant ridge, where layers of mist drifted between the trees like slow-moving ghosts of memory. Then he answered in a voice barely above a whisper. "Something I left behind that was never meant to stay hidden this long." Ranger took 3 deliberate steps toward the forest trail and stopped, waiting as though he already knew exactly where the journey would lead. The decision was made without another word. Ethan locked the truck, slung his weathered backpack over one shoulder, and followed Ranger toward the narrow trail disappearing into the trees. Samuel walked beside them at a steady pace, moving more confidently now than he had on the road, as though each step carried him closer to something his heart had been searching for longer than his mind could measure. The forest welcomed them with a hush that felt almost sacred. Tall pines rose like silent guardians on either side of the path, their trunks dark against the fading afternoon light. Sunbeams filtered through the branches in long golden shafts, painting the forest floor with shifting patterns of light and shadow. Fallen needles softened their footsteps. The air smelled of cedar, moss, and the clean scent of mountain stone cooling beneath the autumn sky. Ranger moved several yards ahead, leading without hesitation. Occasionally he would stop, glance back, and wait until Ethan caught up before continuing. It was the same behavior he had shown years ago during search missions, when instinct seemed to guide him more reliably than maps or equipment. Ethan noticed it immediately. Whatever had captured the dog's attention was growing stronger. After nearly a mile, the trail narrowed. Ferns brushed against their legs. Thick vines hung from ancient branches overhead. Somewhere nearby, water trickled across hidden rocks, creating a gentle rhythm beneath the songs of distant birds. Samuel paused beside a moss-covered boulder and rested one hand against its weathered surface. His eyes drifted across the landscape. "This used to feel smaller," he said softly. "When I was young, every hill seemed manageable. Every journey felt short." Ethan smiled faintly. "Funny how that works." Samuel nodded. "The world stays the same. We are the ones who change." They continued climbing. The terrain grew steeper. The forest thickened around them until the road below was nothing more than a distant memory. Clouds drifted across the mountaintop, their shadows sliding slowly over the hillsides. Ranger suddenly stopped near a fork in the trail. One path curved west through dense timber. The other climbed toward a ridge hidden behind a wall of old spruce trees. The German shepherd stood motionless for several seconds before turning decisively toward the ridge. Samuel stared at the choice and slowly exhaled. "That was not the original path," he whispered. Ethan looked at him. "You remember?" "Every inch of it." Samuel's expression grew thoughtful. "The old trail should have gone the other way." Ranger took several more steps toward the ridge and looked back again. Ethan trusted the dog enough not to question it. They followed. 10 minutes later, the trees began to thin. A cool wind swept across the slope, carrying with it the faint scent of aged wood. Then Ranger froze. His ears lifted high. His tail became still. Ahead, beyond a curtain of vines and tangled brush, something stood hidden among the trees. At first it looked like part of the hillside itself. Then the fading sunlight touched a weathered rooftop barely visible beneath decades of growth. Samuel stopped breathing for a moment. His eyes widened. Before them stood the forgotten house, waiting silently beneath the mountain as though all those lost years had passed in a single afternoon. For a long moment, none of them moved. The mountain seemed to fall silent around the structure, as though the forest itself had been waiting for someone to return. The house stood partially hidden beneath decades of ivy, moss, and climbing vines. Its stone chimney leaned slightly, but remained intact. Weathered cedar boards lined the exterior walls, silvered by time and countless winters. Several windows were clouded with dust, reflecting only fragments of the fading sky. Samuel stared at it with an expression Ethan could not fully read. There was wonder there, certainly. Relief as well. But beneath both emotions lingered something deeper, a quiet ache carried across many years. Ranger broke the silence first. The German shepherd trotted forward through the tall grass surrounding the house. His nose worked constantly, drawing in scents trapped within the old wood and damp earth. Ethan followed carefully while Samuel remained near the edge of the clearing, as though gathering courage before approaching the place he had left behind. A gentle breeze stirred the vines hanging from the roof. Somewhere above them, a wind chime made of rusted spoons turned slowly and released a faint metallic note. The sound drifted through the clearing like an old memory, refusing to disappear. Ranger climbed the sagging front porch and paused beside the weathered door. He sniffed once, then twice. After a moment, he surprised Ethan by turning away from the entrance entirely. Instead of waiting to go inside, the dog moved along the side of the house. His pace quickened. Ethan immediately noticed the change. "What is it, boy?" Ranger continued forward. Around the back of the house, the ground sloped gently downward toward a grove of ancient pines. Ferns covered most of the earth beneath them. Moss draped over fallen logs like green blankets. The air felt cooler there, older somehow. Ranger stopped beside the rear wall. He lowered his head and pressed his nose against the weathered boards. Then he scratched once. Ethan stepped closer. The dog scratched again. Not excited, not frantic, deliberate, focused. Samuel finally reached them and looked at the spot. His brow furrowed. "There was nothing there," he murmured. Ranger ignored both men. He continued examining the wall before moving several feet away and stopping near a patch of unusually thick ivy growing against the foundation stones. His ears lifted. Then he pawed at the ground. Ethan knelt beside him. Beneath the tangled roots and fallen leaves, something felt different. The soil was softer, less compact than the surrounding earth. He brushed away a layer of pine needles and uncovered the edge of a flat stone partially hidden beneath decades of debris. Samuel inhaled sharply. "I do not remember that." Together they cleared more of the area. The stone proved larger than expected, nearly 3 feet wide and perfectly square. It did not belong naturally on the hillside. Ranger sat beside them, watching closely. The fading sunlight filtered through the pines overhead, casting long shadows across the clearing. Ethan slipped his fingers beneath one edge and carefully lifted. The stone shifted with surprising ease. Beneath it lay a narrow metal ring attached to what appeared to be an old wooden hatch concealed below ground level. For several seconds nobody spoke. The forest seemed to hold its breath once again. Samuel stared at the hidden door. His eyes widened slowly. "My mother used to keep journals," he whispered. "Boxes of letters. Family records. She always worried they might be lost someday." His voice trembled slightly. "But she never told me about this." Ranger stood and looked directly at the hidden hatch. Then he turned toward Ethan, his amber eyes unusually bright. The same expression he wore whenever he had found something important, something waiting to be discovered. The wooden hatch remained motionless beneath the fading light, as though it had been waiting patiently through every passing season for someone to lift it again. Ethan brushed away the last of the loose soil gathered around its edges. The wood was old but remarkably well preserved, protected beneath the stone for decades. Tiny beads of moisture glimmered across its surface. Ranger stood beside him, completely focused, his ears pointed forward and his gaze fixed on the hidden entrance. Samuel lowered himself slowly onto one knee. His weathered fingers traced the metal ring with a tenderness usually reserved for treasured photographs. For several seconds he simply stared. Ethan could see memories moving behind the old man's eyes. Not memories of the hatch itself, but of the years connected to whatever rested below it. The forest around them seemed unusually quiet. Even the breeze had softened. Only the distant call of a songbird drifted through the trees. Ethan finally grasped the ring and pulled. The hinges resisted at first, then released with a low groan. Cool air rose from below carrying the scent of cedar, aged paper, and stone. It was not the smell of abandonment. It was the smell of something carefully preserved. Beneath the hatch a narrow staircase descended into darkness. The steps were built from thick timber reinforced with iron brackets. Ethan switched on the flashlight he carried in his pack. A warm beam spilled downward. The staircase disappeared nearly 15 feet beneath the house. Samuel stared in disbelief. "I never knew this was here," he whispered. Ranger descended first. His nails clicked softly against the wooden steps as he moved into the hidden space below. Ethan followed closely behind, while Samuel came last. The air grew cooler with every step. At the bottom, they entered a room larger than any of them expected. Stone walls surrounded the chamber. Heavy cedar shelves lined 3 sides. Dust floated through the flashlight beam like tiny stars suspended in still air. Yet almost everything remained intact. Wooden boxes sat neatly arranged along the shelves. Leather-bound journals rested beside carefully labeled containers. Maps were rolled and tied with faded ribbons. Framed photographs leaned against the far wall beneath protective cloth covers. Samuel slowly removed one cover. Beneath it appeared a photograph of the same mountain house, taken many decades earlier. Fresh paint covered the porch. Flower boxes sat beneath every window. A young woman smiled from the front steps while holding a basket filled with wildflowers. Samuel reached toward the image. His hand trembled. "My mother," he said softly. "She took care of every corner of this place." Ethan noticed something else nearby. Several journals had dates written across their spines. They stretched across decades. Some appeared older than Samuel himself. Others were much newer. "These cannot all be hers," Ethan said. Samuel shook his head. "No." He picked up one of the later volumes and opened it carefully. Inside, neat handwriting filled every page. His expression changed immediately. Surprise, confusion, then wonder. "These are addressed to me." Ethan looked up. "What do you mean?" Samuel turned another page. The writing continued. Every entry began the same way. "Dear Samuel." The old man swallowed hard. "She knew I would come back someday." His voice nearly disappeared. Even after all those years. Ranger suddenly moved toward the far corner of the room. There he stopped beside an old wooden cabinet built directly into the stone wall. The German shepherd sat and looked back at Ethan. Not excited. Not restless. Certain. Ethan approached and noticed a small brass key resting on top of the cabinet. Attached to it was a handwritten note protected beneath a layer of glass. The ink had faded slightly with age, but the message remained clear. For the one who returns with a faithful heart, the final truth waits inside. The note seemed to glow beneath the flashlight beam, not because of the ink or the glass protecting it, but because of the weight carried by every carefully chosen word. Samuel stood motionless beside Ethan. His eyes remained fixed on the message as though he feared it might disappear if he looked away. The underground room felt even quieter now. Beyond the stone walls, evening slowly settled across the mountain. Somewhere above them, wind moved through the pines surrounding the old house, creating a distant whisper that drifted down through the hidden space. Ranger remained seated beside the cabinet. Calm, patient, certain. Ethan carefully lifted the brass key. It felt heavier than expected. Years had darkened the metal, but its craftsmanship remained beautiful. Tiny engravings wound around the shaft in the shape of mountain laurel vines. Whoever had made it had taken great pride in the work. Samuel reached out and touched the cabinet door. His fingertips trembled slightly. "My mother always believed important things deserved their own place," he said softly. "She said treasures were not measured by money. They were measured by what they preserved." Ethan studied the cabinet. Built directly into the stone wall, it looked older than everything else in the room. The wood carried a rich amber color beneath decades of dust. A single lock sat at its center. Nothing elaborate, just simple and strong. Ethan inserted the key. For a brief moment, neither man moved. Then he turned it. A soft click echoed through the chamber. The cabinet door opened slowly. Inside sat several carefully arranged items. Not gold, not cash, not jewels. Instead, there were bundles of letters tied with blue ribbon. More journals, family photographs, land surveys, property records. At the very center rested a polished cedar box no larger than a shoebox. Samuel stared at it. Tears gathered in his eyes before he even reached for it. "I remember this," he whispered. His voice cracked slightly. "She kept her most important papers inside." He lifted the box carefully and placed it on a nearby table. Ranger stood and moved closer. The dog watched quietly as Samuel opened the lid. Inside lay a thick envelope bearing Samuel's name in elegant handwriting. Beneath it rested several legal documents. Samuel picked up the envelope first. The paper had yellowed with age, but the seal remained intact. For a moment he simply held it, gathering strength. Then he opened it and began to read. The room fell silent except for the turning of pages. Ethan watched emotions move across the old man's face. Surprise, sorrow, gratitude, love. Every few seconds Samuel paused, swallowing hard before continuing. Finally, he lowered the letter. His eyes shimmered in the flashlight glow. She knew, he said quietly. Ethan frowned. Knew what? Samuel looked around the hidden room. That I would spend years chasing things that never mattered. He glanced toward the ceiling above them, where the old house waited in the gathering darkness. She wrote that this place was never supposed to belong to just one person. He opened the cedar box again and removed the documents beneath the letter. Property maps unfolded across the table. Survey records. Trust agreements. Pages carefully prepared decades earlier. Ethan stepped closer. The boundaries extended far beyond the house itself. Forest, meadow, streams. Hundreds of acres spread across the mountain. Samuel stared at the documents for a long time before speaking again. I spent 50 years believing I abandoned this place. His voice softened. The truth is, she never stopped preparing it for the future. Ranger suddenly nudged Ethan's hand with his nose. Ethan looked down. The German shepherd's amber eyes reflected the light. Then the dog turned his head toward one final page resting at the bottom of the cedar box. A page neither of them had noticed before. Across the top, written in the same graceful handwriting, appeared a title that made Samuel's breath catch. The steward chosen to continue the mountain's purpose. Samuel carefully lifted the final page from the cedar box and held it beneath the flashlight beam. The paper was older than the others, its edges softened by time, yet every word remained clear. Ethan stood beside him while Ranger settled quietly at their feet. The underground room seemed warmer now, filled not only with the scent of cedar and aged paper, but with the feeling that countless unanswered questions were finally finding their place. Samuel began reading aloud. The document explained that the mountain property had never been intended as a private inheritance. His mother had created a trust decades earlier, long before she passed away. The land, the house, the forest, the streams, and every structure connected to them were to be preserved for a greater purpose. She believed the mountain would one day become a refuge for people carrying burdens too heavy to bear alone. Veterans searching for peace. Travelers who had lost their way. Families rebuilding after hardship. Anyone who needed a place where kindness still mattered. Samuel lowered the page and stared into the distance. Tears glistened in his eyes. I spent my life thinking I failed her, he whispered. I thought leaving meant everything was lost. The old man slowly shook his head. But she never gave up on me. Not once. Ethan looked across the shelves filled with journals and letters. Every detail of the hidden room reflected years of preparation, patience, and faith. Samuel opened another envelope tucked beneath the trust documents. Inside was a handwritten letter addressed not to him, but to whoever eventually stood beside him. His hands trembled as he passed it to Ethan. You should read this, he said quietly. Ethan unfolded the letter. The handwriting matched every other page they had discovered. The message was simple. It spoke of second chances, of people arriving at unexpected moments, and of how life often sends the right companions when the road ahead cannot be walked alone. Near the end came a sentence that caused Ethan to pause. If my son returns, he will not return alone. The one beside him will be the steward chosen to continue what love began. Ethan read the line twice. Then a third time. Silence filled the room. Samuel smiled gently through his tears. I think she was talking about you. Ethan immediately shook his head. You are her son. This belongs to you. Samuel looked around the chamber, then toward the ceiling above them where the old house stood waiting beneath the stars. No, he said softly. I came back to understand the truth. You came because you listened when your dog did. Ranger lifted his head at the sound of Samuel's voice. The old man knelt beside him and rested a hand against the German shepherd's neck. He chose this path before either of us knew where it led. Samuel rose slowly and placed the trust documents into Ethan's hands. The mountain needs someone willing to stay, someone willing to serve others. I spent 50 years running from this responsibility. His expression softened. You have spent your life moving toward it. Above them, a faint gust of wind moved through the hidden vents built into the stone. It sounded almost like a distant sigh of relief, as though the mountain itself had been waiting to hear those words. 1 year later, the mountain no longer felt forgotten. Spring sunlight spilled across the ridge where wildflowers now grew beside the restored trail. The old house stood proudly among the pines once again, its weathered walls repaired, its porch strengthened, and its windows glowing warmly each evening as if welcoming every traveler who happened to wander near. What had once been hidden beneath vines and silence had become a place filled with life. Ethan stood near the front gate on a cool morning, holding a mug of coffee while watching mist drift above the valley below. The view stretched for miles. Forested hills rolled toward the horizon, painted in shades of green and gold. A pair of hawks circled high overhead. Nearby, Ranger rested beneath a cedar tree, older by a year but no less watchful. His amber eyes followed every movement along the trail, always alert, always ready. The property had changed in ways Ethan could never have imagined. The hidden room beneath the house had been carefully preserved. The journals were protected. The letters were cataloged. Samuel's mother's dream had become reality. Veterans searching for peace now visited throughout the year. Families facing difficult seasons found temporary shelter. Hikers stopped to rest on the porch and share stories. No one was turned away. The mountain had become exactly what it had always been intended to become: a refuge. Samuel had remained through the winter that followed their discovery. Together he and Ethan worked side by side repairing fences, restoring paths, and reading through decades of family records. For the first time in many years, the old man seemed at peace. The weight he had carried for half a century gradually disappeared beneath the simple comfort of belonging. When he eventually passed away several months earlier, it happened quietly after an evening spent watching the sunset from the porch he had not seen since his youth. He left with a smile on his face and gratitude in his heart. Ethan often thought about him during the quiet hours before sunrise. He also thought about the strange chain of events that had brought them together. A forgotten road, a patient dog, a mountain waiting for someone to return. Some mysteries never demanded explanation. Perhaps they were never meant to. Ranger suddenly stood and wagged his tail. Ethan followed his gaze toward the trail entrance. A young couple appeared through the trees carrying backpacks and looking slightly uncertain about where they were headed. Ethan smiled and raised a hand in greeting. The couple smiled back. Another story arriving. Another chapter beginning. The wind moved gently through the pines, creating the same soft whisper that had greeted him on the day he first climbed the mountain. Ethan looked toward the distant road hidden beyond the hills. Somewhere out there, countless journeys continued. Yet for the first time in many years, he no longer felt like he was searching for a place to belong. He had found it. Ranger walked over and sat beside him. Together they watched sunlight spread across the valley below. The mountain seemed brighter somehow, as if carrying its own quiet joy. And in that peaceful moment, Ethan finally understood what Samuel's mother had known all along. Sometimes the greatest gifts are not found. They are patiently waiting until kindness finds its way home.